Sony has been a hardware powerhouse through the years, but as far as consumer electronics go, things aren't as rosy as they used to be. At one point in time, people listened to music primarily on a Sony Walkman. At another time, the Sony VAIO was considered a really high-end laptop that a lot of people wanted. But time changed that, and it was really PlayStation that sort of saved Sony, specifically the PlayStation 4. What do I mean? Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on GameRanx, we ask the question, how did the PS4 save Sony? So to begin, obviously the Sony Walkman was a pretty big thing. At this point in time, it's sort of a retro piece of hardware considered kind of cool. A collectible item that you might see in a movie like Ready Player One or something like that. But at one point, it was primarily the way to listen to music on the go. Now we have a slew of $10 MP3 players you can plug a $5 pair of earbuds in and actually not look weird, and most of us forego that and just use our phones. But at one point in time, if you wanted to go jogging with some tunes, you needed to do so with a Sony Walkman, a large, by today's standards large anyway, cassette deck that you could put on a belt loop and plug a pair of massive Sony headphones into. And while this was also the case with the CD Walkman, obviously CDs brought problems along that made them a little less reliable than the audio tape. CDs would skip, and the CD Walkman wasn't nearly as cool. Not to mention, other people were in on that business. The Walkman brand, by the time the CD generation was over, really didn't mean anything. And because people showed that they really don't want to pay for music, a different business model had to be developed. We see that model today now in things like Spotify, but that path diverted music far away from Sony. Sony VAIO laptops, as I mentioned in the intro, were actually pretty awesome, but it's been a while since they made those. Sony sold the VAIO computing business to a Japanese investment firm. The last year of Sony's ownership of the VAIO computing division, they sold something like 7.5 million PCs, so it's not like they were doing badly. They probably just weren't making a lot of money. It's just not a business that makes a lot of sense for a company like Sony that is primarily interested in creating and growing businesses with high margins. And while that may seem kind of obvious, it's also a very important point. We'll get to why in a few. They spun off their TV business on account it had been losing money since 2004, racking up a $6 billion deficit over 9 years. They sold their battery business, which, to be fair, was a very innovative business. They pretty much commercialized the lithium-ion battery back in 1975. Basically, nothing was going that good for Sony. They had their hands in a lot of pots, and not a lot of them were giving anything back. But there is one brand that they owned that has done consistency well its entire lifespan: PlayStation. Sony's CEO, Kaz Hirai, took the helm in 2012 and recognized what was going on. He also recognized what they had that worked. His big plan was something he called One Sony, where Sony pared down its businesses to mainly focus on gaming, its biggest sector, imaging, cameras and other things like that, and mobile, which was not as big a loss as everything else. And through a few smart moves, like when Microsoft announced their always-on DRM quote-unquote feature for the Xbox One, Sony was there to say, oh no, gamers, we know you don't want that. No, come over here to the PlayStation where we understand gamers and that they want games. The thing that we make lets you play games. That's the point. That's all. And over the course of the year previous to the launch of the PlayStation 4, Sony sort of shed a bunch of these businesses. Like I said, they dumped their laptop business. They minimized the business as far as the Walkman. They pared back the number of phones they were putting out. They spun off the Bravia TV brand to avoid massive losses there. Sony invested $3.32 billion in PlayStation 3 and were worried about recouping it. I would guess that they probably got near recouping it. But people like Gabe Newell were saying there's no real reason to invest in the cell processor. It gives you no long-term benefits because you can't apply anything you learn using it anywhere else. That's not exactly what he said, but it was basically the point. To give part of the exact quote, you're not going to gain anything except a hatred of the architecture they've created. Yeah, he really didn't like the PlayStation 3. And let's be entirely clear here, a game console's success really has very little to do with how much the consumer likes the hardware. But if all the good developers don't like the hardware, then how many good games the consumer has to play then starts to become the issue. And when the multi-platform games basically suck on the PS3 compared to the Xbox, I mean, if you remember the original state Bayonetta was released in, yikes. And although I'm sure they didn't lose that entire $3.3 billion, I'm sure they made plenty of it back. The PlayStation 4 needed to be something different, and it needed to focus on making a games console that both developers and gamers really liked. And I think it was all a smart move because they knew what they had in the PlayStation 4. If you're a PC gamer, you know that the secret sauce of the PlayStation 4 is not some massive under-the-hood PC-killing bit of hardware. And it wasn't like that at its launch either. The secret weapon of any console is ease of development and uniformity between hardware. Essentially, it's predictability as well as optimization. You've got room to do it in a way that you don't on a bunch of different hardware. The PlayStation 4's architecture is, of course, a combined APU, which is a GPU and CPU that share RAM, and that worked out very well for them. The sales pitch was good, the launch titles were good, and there was a slew of great games that came almost immediately. Oftentimes, the PlayStation 4 would post the best reviews out of multi-platform titles, and when it launched, in its first year, it sold a massive amount of consoles, much more than the Xbox One and much more than the Nintendo Wii U. It sold so much, executives at Sony were saying things like, and this is a quote, "We do not completely understand what's happening." Considering they had spun off so much of their business, they were almost entirely dependent on the PlayStation 4 in 2013 and 14. And frankly, it wasn't a bad move. The PlayStation 4 has been a really tremendously successful console. And not just the PlayStation 4 itself, but the PlayStation 4 Pro and the various accessories, including pretty much the most successful VR headset. It's certainly not the best VR headset, but it's perhaps the most painless. The PlayStation VR has sold continuously well, as a matter of fact, making it one of the bigger VR successes. And these are the types of things that Sony built on over the following years. Where Sony had been losing money for several years, after a little bit of PlayStation being their primary business, specifically about 78% of all of their business, they were posting a little over $500 million in profit. That was in 2016. And by 2018, that profit had expanded significantly. They posted a $2.62 billion profit in 2018. And frankly, the reason they managed to do this was through reinvesting in some of their core ideas. The PlayStation, of course, was obviously the biggest one, but the Walkman, for instance, is actually a fairly money-making business at this point. Walkman is now an MP3 player for the high-end market. When I say high-end, I mean high-end. Walkman MP3 players cost like $1,000. You can get one that's made out of machined copper for $3,200. And that might sound a little bit counterintuitive considering they got out of the high-end laptop business, but a high-end laptop and a high-end MP3 player are two very different things. A high-end laptop is something that you don't really get a lot margin-wise out of, but a high-end MP3 player, when you're making the best product, you tend to bring in a very large margin. So while they're definitely spending more making an MP3 player that anyone else might be, a fair amount of that is margin. And they've built a few of their businesses in that same way. But again, it's really the bulk of their money coming from PlayStation. The last quarter of 2017, they made almost as much money as they had through the entire 2015 year. And part of that was, again, because they prioritized PlayStation. They stopped spending money where they couldn't make any money back, and they moved into a business they knew was successful. At the same time, Sony Pictures is starting to do better as well, arguably because it had the room to work. The Jumanji series has made them a ton of money. You've seen the new Spider-Man films. They're both quite good. And there's another one coming soon. The question is, would that have happened? Would there have been room to work had they pulled back so far? I think probably no. So the interesting thing to say here is that PlayStation became Sony for a while. And on top of becoming Sony, they sort of became the nurturing force at Sony. The fact that it was profitable and the business strategies they applied in the PlayStation area worked, they were able to take a step back and reevaluate what works and what doesn't in all of their other business. And as CEO, Kaz Hirai stepped down as CEO, instead taking a chairman role and then eventually stepping down, in the upcoming June of 2019 to retire. I think a fair amount of credit needs to be given to this guy. He knew what worked. And if he hadn't have known what worked, and if he hadn't have instituted the strategy he did, Sony may not still be around. If they didn't realize that PlayStation literally was the thing that was working for them, and that business needed to be the primary business, things probably wouldn't have gone this well. But they have gone this well. Sony knows exactly what they're doing, and they know that focusing on gaming is the thing to do. As they continue with the Sony PlayStation 5, the most traditional sounding game console of all of the upcoming game consoles. It seems like Sony knows that keeping it simple and keeping it for gamers is the way to go, and I look forward to seeing exactly what they do with it. What do you think the PlayStation 5 is going to be? What do you think they'll retain that worked? And where do you think everything is going? Leave us a comment, let us know what you're thinking. If you like this video, please click like, and if you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week. The best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription. So click subscribe, and don't forget to click the notification bell. As always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at Falcon the Hero. We'll see you next time, right here on GameRanx.